Racist cop slaps black woman in front of her daughter. What happens next is shocking. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, bathing the suburban street in a golden hue. Naomi Harper drove at a steady pace, her hands gripping the wheel in her usual calm, controlled manner. Her black SUV rolled past rows of neatly trimmed hedges and spotless driveways, the faint hum of the engine blending with the quiet stillness of the neighborhood. In the back seat, her 6-year-old daughter, Ava, swung her legs back and forth in her booster seat, humming softly to herself. Her small voice occasionally broke into a cheerful rendition of a tune from her favorite cartoon, her energy oblivious to the subtle tension radiating from her mother. "Mommy, can we get ice cream later?" Ava chirped, her big brown eyes catching Naomi's in the rearview mirror. Naomi managed a soft smile. "Maybe, sweetie. Let's see how the day goes, okay?" Ava grinned, satisfied with the answer, and returned to her humming. Naomi focused her attention back on the road, her mind only half on the task at hand. She had driven this route dozens of times, enough to know the sequence of every stop sign and the curve of every corner. Today felt no different, or so she told herself. But her stomach had been unsettled for most of the afternoon, a quiet unease she couldn't shake. She glanced in the rearview mirror again, not at Ava this time, but at the empty road stretching behind her. She told herself she was being paranoid, that there was no reason for the creeping discomfort that seemed to follow her. Then the flash of red and blue lights flooded her rearview mirror. The sharp, familiar glare jolted her out of her thoughts. Naomi inhaled deeply, her chest tightening as she signaled and eased the SUV to the side of the road. She reached for the gear shift, her fingers trembling slightly as she put the car in park. "Mommy, what's happening?" Ava's voice broke the silence, her earlier cheer replaced by curiosity and a hint of concern. Naomi glanced back, her expression calm despite the wave of apprehension that rolled through her. "It's okay, Ava," she said softly. "The police just want to talk to Mommy. Stay in your seat and don't worry, all right?" Ava nodded, her little hands gripping the edges of her booster seat. Naomi exhaled slowly and adjusted the rearview mirror, watching as a police cruiser rolled to a stop behind her. The flashing lights reflected off the rear windows of her SUV, their relentless pulse filling the air with a low hum of authority. The officer stepped out of the car, his boots landing heavily on the asphalt. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with deliberate authority. Naomi couldn't see his eyes behind his mirrored sunglasses, but his stiff posture and the sharp set of his jaw spoke volumes. He adjusted his utility belt as he approached the driver's side, the weight of his presence pressing down on the air. Naomi lowered her window and placed both hands on the steering wheel, just as she had been taught. "Good afternoon, officer," she said, her voice steady but polite. The man didn't return the greeting. Instead, he barked, "License and registration." Naomi reached for the glove compartment, her movements slow and deliberate. She retrieved her registration and insurance papers, then reached for her wallet to pull out her driver's license. She handed the documents to the officer, her hands steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her tone calm. He flipped through the papers without responding, his sunglasses reflecting her face back at her. Finally, he spoke. "Where are you coming from?" "We're heading home," Naomi replied, keeping her answers short and polite. The officer's lips pressed into a thin line as he handed her documents back. "Do you live around here?" Naomi hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying. "Yes, officer. Just a few blocks away." His smirk was almost imperceptible, but Naomi caught it. "Funny," he muttered, straightening slightly. "Don't see too many people like you in this neighborhood." Naomi's chest tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. In the back seat, Ava shifted uncomfortably. "Mommy, what does he mean?" Ava asked quietly, her voice small. Naomi turned her head slightly, her tone soft but firm. "Everything's fine, baby. Don't worry." The officer leaned closer, his face inches from the open window. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Naomi blinked, her brow furrowing slightly. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" His tone sharpened. "Do I need to repeat myself?" "Step out of the car. Now." Naomi inhaled deeply and glanced back at Ava, whose wide eyes were fixed on her. "Ava, stay in your seat and don't move. I'll be right back." She opened the door slowly, stepping out with her hands visible. The officer gestured for her to move to the front of the SUV. She complied, her heart pounding as she placed her hands on the hood of the car. "Hands flat," he barked. Naomi spread her fingers, her palms pressing against the warm metal of the hood. The officer moved behind her, patting her pockets with a force that felt more like punishment than procedure. "What exactly are you looking for, officer?" Naomi asked, her voice steady despite the anger rising in her chest. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back and crossed his arms. "What are you doing in this neighborhood? Visiting someone? Delivering something?" Naomi turned her head slightly, her gaze unflinching. "I live here," she said, her voice firm. The officer's smirk returned. "Right. Got anything in the car I should know about? Drugs? Weapons?" "No, officer," Naomi replied evenly. "There's nothing illegal in my car." In the back seat, Ava's voice trembled. "Mommy, what's happening?" Naomi started to respond, but the officer turned sharply, snapping at the child. "Quiet!" Ava shrank back, her little body trembling as tears welled in her eyes. Naomi stepped forward instinctively, her voice cutting through the tension. "Don't you dare speak to my daughter like that!" The officer turned toward her, his expression twisting into one of barely contained rage. Before Naomi could react, his hand came up in a swift motion. The slap echoed down the empty street like a gunshot. Naomi staggered but didn't fall, her hand flying to her cheek. From behind her, Ava's terrified scream pierced the air. "Mommy!" Ava cried, her voice cracking with fear. Naomi steadied herself, her breathing shallow as her vision blurred. The officer stood over her, his chest heaving. The street fell silent for a moment, except for Ava's sobs. Then, faintly, the sound of a phone camera clicking broke the stillness. The street remained eerily still after the sharp crack of the slap. The only sounds were Ava's muffled sobs and the distant hum of a lawnmower several houses down. Naomi stood motionless by the hood of the car, her cheek throbbing with a fiery sting. She refused to let the officer see her falter, though her heart raced wildly in her chest. "Get back in the car," the officer growled, his tone dripping with authority. Naomi turned to face him, her gaze unwavering despite the fear gnawing at her. For a fleeting moment, she considered responding, challenging him, but Ava's cries tethered her. She knew she couldn't escalate this, not with her daughter watching. Swallowing the lump in her throat, Naomi stepped back toward the driver's seat. "Mommy, are you okay?" Ava's voice trembled as Naomi opened the car door. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Naomi said softly, though her voice cracked slightly. She crouched to meet Ava's tear-filled eyes. "Stay calm, okay? Mommy's going to handle this." Naomi gently touched her daughter's hand, hoping to transfer a sense of calm she didn't fully feel herself. Ava nodded hesitantly, wiping her tears as Naomi straightened and returned to her seat. She closed the door with deliberate slowness, her movements controlled. The officer loomed outside her window, his hands resting on his hips. He glanced briefly at Ava before leaning down, his sunglasses reflecting Naomi's face once more. "You're lucky I'm not taking this further," he said, his voice low and threatening. "I don't want to see you in this neighborhood again." Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles whitening as she forced herself to remain silent. She kept her eyes forward, refusing to dignify his words with a response. The officer lingered a moment longer before stepping back toward his cruiser. As he turned, he froze. A few yards away, a man stood on the sidewalk, his phone raised. His casual clothing and unassuming demeanor made him blend into the quiet street, but the phone in his hand spoke volumes. The officer's jaw clenched. "Hey," he barked, stalking toward the man. "What do you think you're doing?" The man didn't flinch. He continued to hold his phone steady, his expression calm but firm. "Just making sure everything's on record," he said evenly. "Put that phone away," the officer snapped, his hand drifting toward the taser on his belt. I'm on a public street, the man replied, his tone unshaken. And I'm not interfering. Just documenting. Naomi watched the exchange from her seat, her chest tightening. She glanced at Ava, who was staring wide-eyed out the window. Naomi reached over and gently turned her daughter's head away. Look at me, baby, she whispered. Not outside. The officer squared his shoulders, stepping closer to the man. I said, put the phone away, he repeated, his voice rising. The man raised his free hand in a placating gesture. Relax, officer. I'm not looking for trouble. His voice was calm, but his phone remained steady, its camera still pointed at the officer. Naomi's pulse quickened as she realized the tension was escalating again. Her mind raced. She knew the man's actions could provoke the officer further, and she silently prayed he would stay safe. You want trouble, the officer sneered, taking another step closer. His hand gripped the taser on his belt, but before he could draw it, the man lowered his phone slightly. No need for that, the man said, his tone light but deliberate. This is going straight to the cloud. Even if you take my phone, the video's already backed up. The officer froze, his face hardening as he realized the implications. His hand dropped from the taser, but the tension in his posture didn't ease. Get out of here, he snarled, his voice tight. The man gave a small nod and took a step back, still holding his phone in plain sight. You have a good day, officer, he said before turning and walking away at a measured pace. Naomi watched as the officer stood there for a moment, his fists clenched at his sides. He finally turned and walked back to his cruiser, muttering under his breath. Naomi's breath hitched as she saw him glance at her one last time before getting into his car and slamming the door. The flashing lights disappeared as the cruiser sped off down the street. Naomi sat frozen for a moment, her hand still gripping the steering wheel. Her cheek throbbed, her body tense, but her mind was already moving ahead. Mommy, is it over? Ava's voice broke the silence, small and hesitant. Naomi turned to her daughter, forcing a soft smile. Yes, baby. It's over. But the weight in her voice betrayed her words. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she unlocked it. The man who had filmed the incident walked quickly, his phone gripped tightly in his hand. He glanced over his shoulder once to ensure the officer hadn't followed him. His face was calm, but his heart raced. He stopped at the corner, opened a messenger app, and typed a brief message. It's worse than I thought. Sending the video now. He attached the file and pressed send. Within seconds, the video began uploading, its journey already out of his hands. The air inside the SUV felt heavy, thick with an unspoken tension that neither Naomi nor Ava could escape. Naomi gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white, as she tried to focus on her breathing. Ava sat quietly in her booster seat, her small hands clutching the fabric of her dress as she stared at her mother's profile. Mommy, your face, it's red, Ava said softly, her voice trembling. Naomi glanced into the rearview mirror, catching sight of the faint outline of her own cheek. The stinging slap had left an angry mark that burned not just her skin but something deeper, something that no amount of time would erase. She forced a weak smile, her voice calm but tight. I'm okay, sweetheart. Mommy's okay. Ava didn't respond, but her wide, teary eyes spoke volumes. Naomi reached back and placed a hand on her daughter's knee, giving it a gentle squeeze. You were very brave today, Ava. I'm so proud of you. The little girl nodded slowly, though her expression didn't change. Naomi took another steadying breath and started the engine. She pulled away from the curb, her movements deliberate, her mind already racing with what to do next. A few miles away, in a small apartment, Marcus Daniels stared at his phone. He was the man who had recorded the incident on the quiet suburban street, and his heart was still pounding from the confrontation with the officer. The video he'd uploaded earlier was already gaining traction. Comments poured in faster than he could read them, the tone of outrage and disbelief unmistakable. I can't believe this is still happening. When will it stop? We need justice for this woman. Someone find out her name. She needs a lawyer ASAP. Marcus scrolled through the flood of messages, his hands trembling slightly. He hadn't intended to get involved, but he couldn't walk away after what he'd witnessed. His inbox was already filling with requests from activists and reporters, all asking for details about the video. A notification popped up on his screen. The video had been shared thousands of times in less than an hour. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. The weight of what he'd set into motion settled over him. This wasn't just a video anymore. It was a spark, and the fire was already spreading. Naomi pulled into the driveway of her modest home, the familiar sight of the small porch and neatly trimmed bushes offering little comfort. She turned off the engine and sat in silence for a moment, her hand still gripping the key in the ignition. "Are we home?" Ava asked quietly. "Yes, baby," Naomi replied. She turned to face her daughter, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "Go inside and wash up. I'll be right there." Ava hesitated, her small face filled with worry. "Are you coming too?" Naomi nodded. "Yes, just give me a minute, okay?" Ava reluctantly unbuckled her seatbelt and climbed out of the car. Naomi watched her walk up the steps to the front door, her little shoulders slumped. Once Ava disappeared inside, Naomi let her head fall against the steering wheel. Her hands trembled as she closed her eyes, the events of the day replaying in her mind. She had to do something, anything. But what? She didn't even know where to begin. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up, her heart sinking as she saw the flurry of notifications. Missed calls, texts, and emails from numbers she didn't recognize. She unlocked the phone and opened her messages. One caught her attention immediately. "Ms. Harper, this is the Daniels Justice Initiative. We've seen the video. Please call us. We want to help." Naomi's breath caught. Her fingers hovered over the screen as doubt and hesitation warred within her. Could she trust them? Did she even want to involve herself in something bigger than the horror she'd already endured? But the image of Ava's terrified face filled her mind, and Naomi made her decision. She dialed the number, her hand steady despite the storm raging inside her. The call connected after one ring. "Ms. Harper," a woman's voice asked, calm but urgent. "Yes," Naomi replied, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm ready to talk." Back at the precinct, Officer Todd Carter sat at his desk, his jaw clenched. The routine hum of the station around him felt like an intrusion as he scrolled through his own phone. The video. It was everywhere. He had tried to dismiss it as nothing, but now it was clear that wasn't going to happen. "Todd," a voice called from behind him. It was his partner, Officer Blake. "Captain wants to see you." Carter's stomach twisted. He nodded, rising from his chair. As he walked toward the captain's office, whispers followed him. Officers glanced at him from the corners of their eyes, their expressions unreadable. He forced himself to walk tall, but his pulse raced. When he entered the captain's office, the door closed behind him with a heavy thud. Captain Barnes sat behind his desk, his face grim. He gestured for Carter to sit. "What's going on?" Carter asked, his voice attempting confidence. Barnes didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his computer monitor toward Carter. The video played on the screen, the slap reverberating through the small office. Carter's face paled as he watched. "You care to explain this?" Barnes asked, his tone icy. Carter opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The video ended, leaving a deafening silence between them. "You've got a problem, Todd," Barnes said finally. "And now so do I." Back in his apartment, Marcus refreshed his screen again. The number of views had doubled in the past 10 minutes. The video was no longer confined to social media. It was being picked up by major news outlets. "Breaking: Disturbing police encounter sparks outrage," read one headline. Another asked, "Is this another case of police brutality?" Marcus set his phone down and rubbed his temples. He hadn't expected this level of attention, but he knew there was no going back. He had done the right thing, and now the world was watching. Naomi stepped back into her house, the door clicking shut behind her. Ava was sitting at the kitchen table, drawing quietly. Naomi's phone buzzed again, and she glanced at it, her heart racing as she read the latest notification. The tide was turning, but the fight was only beginning. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across Naomi's neighborhood. Inside her modest home, the air was heavy with tension. Naomi sat at the edge of the kitchen table, her phone in hand, staring at the screen. Notifications popped up relentlessly, a constant stream of texts, calls, and emails. Each one felt like a small explosion in her already overwhelmed mind. Ava sat across from her, scribbling on a piece of paper with her crayons. The soft scratching sound was the only noise in the room. Naomi glanced at her daughter, the small figure a poignant reminder of why she couldn't crumble under the weight of what had happened. She reached out, placing a gentle hand on Ava's. "What are you drawing, baby?" Naomi asked, her voice soft but strained. Ava looked up, her big eyes still clouded with worry. "It's us," she said, holding up the paper. On it were two stick figures, one taller than the other, standing next to a sun and a house. "That's you, and that's me. We're happy here." Naomi's chest tightened. She managed a small smile. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." Before she could say more, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from the same number she had spoken to earlier, the Daniels Justice Initiative. Naomi hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen before she finally answered. "Ms. Harper," the calm voice on the other end greeted her. "This is Angela Daniels again. I just wanted to follow up on our earlier conversation." Naomi glanced at Ava before standing and moving to the living room, out of earshot. "I appreciate you reaching out," Naomi said, her tone cautious. "But I need to know more about what this would involve." Angela's voice was steady but urgent. "We want to offer you legal representation, free of charge. Your story needs to be told, and the video that's circulating has already started a conversation. With your permission, we'd like to take this case to the next level." Naomi leaned against the wall, her free hand gripping her elbow. "What does that mean, exactly?" "It means holding the officer accountable," Angela replied, "and making sure this kind of behavior doesn't go unchecked. But it's entirely your choice. We won't pressure you." Naomi closed her eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She thought of Ava, how scared she had been, how quiet she had become since the incident. This wasn't just about her. It was about her daughter, and every other person who might face the same injustice. "All right," Naomi said finally. "I'm in." At the precinct, Captain Barnes sat behind his desk, his face grim as he reviewed the fallout. The video had gone viral, and his office phone hadn't stopped ringing since morning. Reporters, city officials, and even activists were demanding answers. The department's public relations team was scrambling to put together a statement, but Barnes knew it wouldn't be enough. Officer Carter stood across from him, his arms crossed and his face pale. "This is getting out of hand, Captain," he said, his voice defensive. "It's just a misunderstanding." "Hey, stop," Barnes interrupted, his tone sharp. He stood, his palms flat on the desk. "This isn't just about you, Carter. This is about the department, the city, and the public trust. And right now we're losing." Carter's jaw tightened. "I did my job." "Your job," Barnes repeated, his voice laced with frustration. "Your job was to de-escalate. Instead, you've put us all in the line of fire." There was a knock at the door, and an officer poked his head in. "Captain, we've got reporters outside. They're asking for a comment on the video." Barnes pinched the bridge of his nose. "No comment. Tell them we're investigating." The officer nodded and disappeared. Barnes turned back to Carter, his expression hard. "You're suspended, effective immediately. Hand in your badge and weapon." Carter's face flushed with anger. "Suspended? Are you kidding me? For what?" "For putting this department in the crosshairs," Barnes snapped. "Now get out of my office before I make this worse for you." Carter glared at him but didn't argue further. He slammed his badge and gun onto the desk and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Miles away, in a bustling newsroom, Marcus Daniels sat at a desk surrounded by reporters. The video he had uploaded had already been shared across major networks, and his phone buzzed non-stop with requests for interviews. Despite the chaos, Marcus remained calm, his focus unshaken. "Mr. Daniels," a reporter called, stepping up to his desk. "Do you know the woman in the video?" Marcus shook his head. "No, but she needs justice. That's all I know." The reporter nodded, scribbling notes on her pad. "The video's been trending for hours. People are calling it a turning point. Do you think it will lead to real change?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "It's a start," he said simply. "But it's not enough. Real change takes more than a video." That evening, Naomi sat on the couch, her phone resting on her lap. Ava had fallen asleep beside her, her small body curled up with her head on Naomi's arm. Naomi stroked her daughter's hair absent-mindedly as she scrolled through the flood of messages and headlines on her phone. Mother and daughter victims of brutal police encounter. Viral video sparks outrage against officers' actions. Will this be the case that changes everything? Naomi's phone buzzed with a new message from Angela Daniels. "We've scheduled a press conference for tomorrow. We'll guide you every step of the way." Naomi's heart raced. A press conference. The thought of standing in front of cameras, of reliving the moment in front of strangers, was daunting. But she knew it was necessary. The world needed to hear her story, not just for her, but for Ava. She leaned her head back against the couch, her resolve strengthening. The storm was building, but she was ready to face it. The morning air was crisp and cool, but Naomi felt none of it as she stood in the small room behind the podium. The Daniels Justice Initiative had rented a modest community center for the press conference, and the low hum of voices from the crowd outside filtered through the walls. Naomi's hand rested gently on Ava's shoulder. The little girl looked up at her mother with wide, curious eyes, clutching a small stuffed animal she had insisted on bringing. Naomi knelt, bringing herself to Ava's level. "Are you okay, baby?" Naomi asked, brushing a stray curl from Ava's face. Ava nodded, though her lips pressed together in a way that told Naomi she was nervous. "Mommy, why are there so many people here?" Naomi paused, choosing her words carefully. "They want to hear about what happened to us, so they can help make sure it doesn't happen again." Ava tilted her head. "Are you going to tell them about the bad man?" Naomi's chest tightened, but she smiled softly. "Yes, sweetheart. But you don't have to worry about anything. Just stay by me, okay?" Ava nodded again, her grip on the stuffed animal tightening. Naomi kissed her daughter's forehead and stood, taking a deep breath. Angela Daniels approached from the doorway, her calm demeanor a steadying presence. "We're ready whenever you are," Angela said, her voice low. Naomi nodded, glancing one last time at Ava before following Angela out into the main hall. The room was packed with reporters, cameras, and members of the community. A podium stood at the front, microphones clustered on its surface like an invasive mass. The flashes from the cameras started immediately as Naomi walked to the podium, Ava's small hand clasped tightly in hers. The noise in the room subsided as Angela stepped forward, raising her hand to signal silence. "Good morning," Angela began, her voice commanding but measured. "Thank you all for being here. Today, we take the first step in holding those in power accountable for their actions. Ms. Naomi Harper and her daughter, Ava, have courageously agreed to share their story with you. Please remember to respect their privacy as they speak." Angela stepped aside, and Naomi moved to the podium. The microphones loomed large in front of her, and the room's silence felt deafening. She glanced down at Ava, who stood at her side, her tiny hand still gripping Naomi's. Naomi cleared her throat, her voice steady but quiet. "My name is Naomi Harper, and I'm here today because of something that happened to me and my daughter a few days ago. Something that should never happen to anyone." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "I was stopped by a police officer for no reason. He questioned me aggressively, searched me without cause, and when I stood up for myself and my daughter, he struck me. He struck me in front of my 6-year-old daughter." Gasps rippled through the audience, the weight of her words settling over the room. Naomi glanced down at Ava, who looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes. "This isn't just about me," Naomi continued, her voice growing stronger. This is about my daughter, who had to watch her mother be treated like she didn't matter. This is about every person who has ever felt powerless in the face of those who are supposed to protect us." A hand shot up from the crowd, a reporter eager to ask a question. Naomi nodded toward him. "Ms. Harper," the reporter began, "your story has sparked outrage across the country. What do you hope to achieve by coming forward?" Naomi straightened her shoulders. "I want justice, not just for me, but for everyone who has faced this kind of abuse. I want accountability for the officer who did this, and I want change within the system that allowed it to happen." Another reporter spoke up. "What's your message to the officer involved?" Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, she didn't answer, the memory of the officer's hand striking her flashing in her mind. Finally, she said, "My message is simple. You don't get to treat people this way and walk away without consequences." The crowd murmured in agreement, the flashes of cameras capturing every word. As Naomi finished speaking, Ava tugged on her mother's hand. Naomi looked down, startled to see her daughter stepping forward toward the microphones. The room quieted again, all eyes on the small child clutching her stuffed animal. "Mommy said the bad man can't hurt us anymore," Ava said, her voice soft but clear. She looked out at the crowd, her innocence shining through her words. "I don't want him to hurt anyone else's mommy either." The room fell completely silent. Even the reporters, so accustomed to chasing headlines, seemed stunned by the weight of Ava's words. Naomi bent down, placing a hand on Ava's shoulder, her eyes glistening. "You're so brave, baby," Naomi whispered. Ava smiled faintly and stepped back, nestling herself against her mother's side. The press conference dominated the evening news cycle. Clips of Naomi's speech and Ava's heartfelt moments circulated rapidly, sparking widespread outrage and solidarity. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForNaomi and #ProtectOurFamilies. That night, Naomi sat with Ava on the couch, watching the news coverage in silence. Ava had fallen asleep, her head resting on Naomi's lap, her stuffed animal clutched tightly in her arms. Naomi stroked her daughter's hair, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Pride, exhaustion, fear, and determination. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a message from Angela Daniels. "You were incredible today. Stay strong. This is just the beginning." Naomi exhaled deeply, her resolve strengthening. For Ava, for herself, and for every person who had been silenced, she would see this through to the end. The day after the press conference, the city was electric with conversation. News outlets replayed Naomi's speech and Ava's innocent yet powerful words on a loop. Across social media, calls for accountability grew louder, with activists, community leaders, and even celebrities weighing in. The Daniels Justice Initiative had announced that they would be filing formal charges against the officer, and public attention was now firmly fixed on the police department. Officer Todd Carter sat alone in the break room of the precinct, the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional crackle of a police radio the only sounds. His coffee sat untouched on the table in front of him, the steam dissipating into the cold, sterile air. He scrolled through his phone, his jaw tightening as he read the headlines. Mother and daughter stand up to police brutality. Officer Carter under fire. Department faces scrutiny. Naomi Harper speaks out against abuse of power. The comments beneath the articles were worse. "This officer needs to be in jail, not on the streets." How many more times will this happen before we see real change? Cowards in uniform think they can get away with anything. Carter slammed his phone down on the table, his breathing ragged. His suspension hadn't made things any easier. Without the badge, he felt exposed, stripped of the power that had once shielded him. The whispers from his colleagues hadn't stopped, and now even his superiors were keeping their distance. The door to the break room opened, and Captain Barnes stepped in, his expression grim. "Carter," Barnes said flatly, closing the door behind him. Carter straightened, attempting to mask his unease. "Captain, if this is about the press conference—" "It's not just the press conference," Barnes interrupted, his tone sharp. "The DOJ has officially opened an investigation into the precinct. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about all of us." Carter's face paled. "What are you saying?" I'm saying you'd better get your story straight, Barnes replied, his voice low. Because when the DOJ starts digging, they'll find everything. And if you think I'm going to let this entire department go down because of your screw-up, you're mistaken. Carter opened his mouth to respond, but Barnes didn't wait for an answer. He turned and left the room, leaving Carter alone with the weight of his words. Meanwhile, at the Daniels Justice Initiative office, Naomi sat across from Angela Daniels in a modest conference room. The table was strewn with legal documents, and a laptop sat open, displaying the video of the incident. Angela leaned forward, her sharp eyes scanning the pages in front of her. The good news is, we have a strong case, Angela said, tapping the papers. The video alone is damning. But we're going to need more if we want to ensure this officer is held accountable. Naomi frowned, her hands folded tightly in her lap. What more could we need? The video shows everything. It does, Angela agreed. But cases like this don't just rest on evidence. They rest on public perception, on pressure. The more voices we have demanding accountability, the harder it will be for the system to ignore us. Naomi sighed, her eyes drifting to the laptop screen. The image of the officer's raised hand froze in her mind, followed by the sound of Ava's terrified cry. I don't want this to become a spectacle, she said quietly. I just want justice. Angela's expression softened. I know. And that's exactly why we need to keep the momentum going. People are listening, Naomi. Now we need to make sure they act. The door to the conference room opened, and a young man stepped in, carrying a folder. Ms. Daniels, we've got the preliminary findings from the officer's record, he said, handing her the folder. Angela flipped it open, her eyes scanning the contents. Her brow furrowed. Well, this is interesting, she murmured. Naomi leaned forward. What is it? Angela looked up, her expression serious. It seems Officer Carter has a history. Complaints of excessive force, verbal harassment, even a few incidents where his reports didn't match witness statements. Most of it was swept under the rug. Naomi's heart sank. How is he still on the force? Because the system protects people like him, Angela said, closing the folder. But this time, it's not going to be so easy for them to cover it up. Later that afternoon, a team from the Department of Justice arrived at the precinct. Their presence was impossible to ignore. Suits and badges moving through the halls with quiet authority. They began interviewing officers, reviewing records, and requesting access to body cam footage and internal reports. Captain Barnes watched from his office window, his face a mask of barely contained frustration. He knew this was only the beginning. Once the DOJ started digging, there was no telling what they would uncover. In the briefing room, Agent Samantha Reed sat across from Officer Blake Harwell, Carter's former partner. Her voice was calm but firm as she questioned him. Officer Harwell, were you present during the incident involving Officer Carter and Ms. Harper? She asked. Harwell shifted uncomfortably. No, I wasn't there. I heard about it afterward. And what did you hear? Reed pressed. Harwell hesitated, his gaze darting to the recorder on the table. Just that things got out of hand. Carter can be intense. Reed raised an eyebrow. Intense? Would you describe his behavior as professional? Harwell swallowed hard. Look, Carter's had his moments, but we all have. It's a tough job. And those moments, did you ever report them? Reed asked, her tone sharp. Harwell looked down, his silence speaking volumes. That evening, Naomi returned home to find a crowd gathered outside her house. At first, her stomach dropped, fearing more unwanted attention. But as she stepped out of the car, she realized these weren't reporters or gawkers. They were neighbors, friends, and supporters. Signs reading justice for Naomi and end police brutality filled the air, and the sound of chants echoed down the street. A woman approached her, smiling warmly. We're here for you, Naomi, she said. We're not letting this go. Naomi blinked back tears, her heart swelling with gratitude. She glanced down at Ava, who clutched her hand tightly. Thank you, Naomi said, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. As she stepped inside, The chants outside grew louder, a steady rhythm of solidarity and hope. The storm was building, but Naomi was no longer facing it alone. The fight for justice had begun in earnest, and the system that had tried to silence her was about to face the full force of the truth. The following morning, Officer Todd Carter sat in his small apartment, the curtains drawn tightly against the daylight. His once pristine uniform hung in the corner, abandoned and gathering dust. His badge and gun were gone, surrendered to the department after his suspension. His world had shrunk to the confines of this space, where the only sounds were the constant buzzing of his phone and the muffled voices of reporters on the television. Carter paced the floor, his bare feet making dull thuds against the worn carpet. His phone sat on the coffee table, its screen lighting up repeatedly with notifications. He ignored most of them, but one headline caught his eye. Officer Todd Carter faces mounting pressure as investigation deepens. He grabbed the remote and turned up the volume on the TV. A news anchor's voice filled the room, her tone sharp and authoritative. The Department of Justice continues its investigation into Officer Carter and the broader practices of the police department. Sources indicate that Carter's history includes multiple complaints of excessive force and misconduct, many of which were dismissed without formal inquiry. The screen switched to footage of Naomi's press conference. Her calm, resolute voice rang through the air, followed by Ava's small but powerful words. Carter's jaw tightened as he watched. "This is getting out of control," he muttered to himself, running a hand through his hair. He grabbed his phone, scrolling through his contacts before stopping at one name: Blake Harwell. Blake Harwell was sitting in his squad car outside a quiet neighborhood when his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and frowned. Carter's name flashed across it. After a moment of hesitation, he answered. "Carter," he said, his tone cautious. "Blake, we need to talk," Carter said quickly, his voice tense. "This thing is blowing up. I need your help." Blake sighed, leaning back in his seat. "Help? Todd, you're on your own. The DOJ is crawling all over the precinct. You think I want to get caught up in this mess?" "I didn't ask for this," Carter snapped. "That woman, she's making me out to be a monster. And now the whole department's under fire because of me." Blake shook his head. "You did this to yourself. I told you before, you've got to watch how you handle people. But you never listened." Carter's voice grew more desperate. "Blake, come on. You know how things work. You've seen me out there. I was just doing my job." Blake's silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally he said, "Todd, this isn't about the job anymore. This is about the fact that you crossed a line, and now everyone's paying the price." "So that's it?" Carter demanded. "You're just going to let them hang me out to dry?" "I can't save you, Todd," Blake said quietly. "And honestly, I'm not sure I want to." The line went dead, leaving Carter staring at his phone in disbelief. Meanwhile, Naomi sat in the Daniels Justice Initiative office. A fresh wave of documents spread across the table in front of her. Angela Daniels was there, along with a young paralegal who was meticulously organizing witness statements and police records. "This is strong," Angela said, holding up a report. "The DOJ's investigation is uncovering patterns of misconduct in the department that go far beyond Carter. It's not just about what happened to you. It's about systemic abuse." Naomi nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. Her thoughts kept returning to Ava, who was at home with a neighbor. The press coverage had made it difficult for Naomi to move freely in public without being recognized. The weight of the attention was exhausting, but she refused to let it deter her. "What happens next?" Naomi asked, her voice firm. Angela leaned forward. "Next, we press harder. The DOJ is going to dig deeper, but public pressure is what will keep this from fading into the background. We need to keep the story alive." Naomi exhaled deeply, her resolve hardening. "Whatever it takes," she said. "I won't let this get swept under the rug." That evening, a candlelight vigil was held in the park near Naomi's neighborhood. Hundreds of people gathered, holding signs that read "Justice for Naomi" and "End Police Brutality." The soft glow of the candles created a sea of light, and the sound of people chanting filled the air. Naomi stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart heavy yet hopeful. Ava clung to her hand, her small face illuminated by the candlelight. A community leader stepped onto a small platform, addressing the crowd with a powerful voice. We're here tonight because what happened to Naomi and Ava is not an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern, a system that needs to change. And we won't stop until it does. The crowd erupted in applause, their voices rising in unison. Naomi felt a lump form in her throat as she looked down at Ava, who was staring at the crowd with wide eyes. "Mommy," Ava whispered, tugging on her hand. "They're all here for us?" Naomi knelt, her eyes glistening. "Yes, baby. They're here for us. And for everyone who's ever been hurt like this." Ava nodded, her small fingers tightening around Naomi's. "I think we're brave." Naomi smiled through her tears. "We are, sweetheart. We are." Back in his apartment, Carter sat in the dark, nursing a drink. The weight of his suspension, the investigation, and the relentless media attention had become unbearable. He stared at his phone, scrolling through the growing number of messages and calls he had ignored. One name caught his attention: Captain Barnes. He hesitated before opening the message. "Todd, we need to talk. The DOJ is closing in, and it's not looking good. Call me." Carter leaned back in his chair, the room spinning slightly. He knew what Barnes wanted: damage control. But Carter also knew that the truth was catching up to him. The walls were closing in, and he was running out of time. The city buzzed with anticipation as the case against Officer Todd Carter gained momentum. The DOJ investigation was in full swing, with agents uncovering years of internal misconduct and a trail of ignored complaints that implicated not only Carter but other officers as well. Public outcry grew louder with each revelation, and protests spread to neighboring communities. Naomi stood in her living room, surrounded by files and notes provided by Angela Daniels. Her laptop displayed live footage of a news broadcast covering the protests outside the precinct. The reporter's voice carried a mix of urgency and gravity. This story has captured the nation's attention as calls for justice and reform echo across the city. The Department of Justice investigation has expanded, with sources indicating that Officer Todd Carter's history of misconduct is far more extensive than initially believed. Naomi muted the television and leaned against the table, her hands gripping the edge. The weight of the past week threatened to overwhelm her, but every time she thought about giving in, Ava's small voice rang in her mind. "Mommy, I think we're brave." Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Angela. "Naomi," Angela began, her tone brisk, "we've got something big. The DOJ just uncovered evidence that Carter's misconduct was covered up by senior officers. This could blow the case wide open." Naomi's heart raced. "What kind of evidence?" "Internal emails, reports that were altered or dismissed outright," Angela explained. "And it's not just Carter. This implicates half the leadership at the precinct." Naomi exhaled sharply. "What does this mean for our case?" "It means we're no longer just fighting Carter," Angela said. "We're fighting an entire system. But this is the leverage we need to ensure real accountability." Naomi nodded, her determination renewed. "What do we do next?" "We keep the pressure on," Angela replied. "And I need you to be ready. The DOJ is planning to make a public announcement tomorrow. Your voice will matter more than ever." Across town, Carter sat in the dim light of his apartment, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table in front of him. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional sound of his phone buzzing with missed calls and messages. He ignored them all. The walls seemed to close in around him as he scrolled through social media. Videos of the protests, clips from Naomi's press conference, and endless comments condemning him flooded his feed. His name was everywhere, and not in the way he had once imagined when he joined the force. A knock at the door jolted him. He froze, his heart pounding. The knock came again, louder this time. Carter stood slowly, his hands trembling as he approached the door. Peering through the peephole, he saw Blake Harwell standing outside, his expression tense. Carter opened the door reluctantly. "What do you want, Blake?" Blake stepped inside, his gaze scanning the disheveled apartment. "You look like hell, Todd." "Thanks for the observation," Carter muttered, closing the door. "What are you doing here?" Blake crossed his arms. You're in deeper than you think. The DOJ isn't just after you, they're tearing apart the whole department. And they're finding things, Todd. Things that could put people like me in their crosshairs, too. Carter scoffed. So now you care? You weren't exactly helpful when I needed you. I'm here now, Blake said sharply. And I'm telling you, you need to come clean. If you don't, they'll bury you. And they'll take the rest of us down with you. Carter's jaw tightened. Come clean. You think they'll just let me walk away if I start talking? Blake leaned closer, his voice low. You don't have a choice anymore. They've got evidence, Todd. Real evidence. If you cooperate, maybe, just maybe, you'll get out of this with something left. Carter stared at him, his mind racing. The thought of admitting to anything made his stomach churn, but the weight of the investigation was becoming impossible to ignore. Think about it, Blake said, heading for the door. But don't take too long. Time's running out. The next day, the DOJ held a press conference on the steps of City Hall. Agents in suits stood in a line behind the podium, their presence a clear indication of the seriousness of the investigation. The lead investigator, Agent Samantha Reed, stepped forward, her expression grave. Naomi and Angela watched the broadcast from the Daniels Justice Initiative office, the tension in the room palpable. After a thorough investigation, Agent Reed began, the Department of Justice has uncovered evidence of widespread misconduct within the precinct, including the deliberate suppression of complaints, falsification of reports, and a pattern of discriminatory practices. Gasps rippled through the reporters. Reed continued, her tone unyielding. We will be pursuing charges against multiple individuals, including Officer Todd Carter, for their role in perpetuating these abuses. This is a step toward accountability, but we recognize that much work remains to be done to rebuild trust within this community. Naomi's chest tightened as she listened. The words felt surreal, a vindication of everything she had endured. Angela placed a hand on her shoulder. This is because of you, Naomi. You started this. That evening, the protests swelled to their largest size yet. People flooded the streets with signs, chants, and unwavering energy. Naomi joined the crowd, Ava by her side, and the sight took her breath away. Strangers smiled at her, offering words of support and gratitude. At the front of the march, Naomi stepped onto a small platform, the crowd falling silent as she took the microphone. Her voice trembled at first, but quickly grew stronger. This isn't just about me, she began. This is about every person who has been silenced, ignored, or hurt by those who were supposed to protect us. Today, we stand together and say, no more. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices rising like a wave. Naomi stepped back, tears streaming down her face as Ava hugged her tightly. In his apartment, Carter stared at his phone, the DOJ's press conference playing on the screen. His world had crumbled, but one thing was clear. The truth was coming for him, whether he liked it or not. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. When the voice on the other end answered, Carter's voice was low and uncertain. I want to talk. I'm ready to make a deal. The weight of Carter's decision bore down on him as he drove through the darkened streets. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the leather. The car's interior was eerily silent, the faint hum of the engine the only sound accompanying his thoughts. The destination loomed in his mind, the DOJ field office. He had made the call earlier that evening, and the voice on the other end had been calm but firm. We'll hear what you have to say, Officer Carter. But know this. Cooperation doesn't guarantee leniency. The words had left a sour taste in his mouth, but he had no other option. He couldn't fight the storm alone. Carter sat in the cold, windowless room, the metal chair creaking under his weight. Agent Samantha Reed entered, her presence commanding. She placed a folder on the table and sat across from him, her sharp eyes never leaving his face. Officer Carter, she began, her voice even. You've asked to cooperate. Let's hear it. Carter shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting to the recorder on the table. I'm not the only one, he said finally. You're looking at me like I'm the problem, but the whole system is broken. You want the truth? I'll give it to you, but I'm not taking all the blame. Reed leaned back slightly, her expression unreadable. "We're not here for a scapegoat. We're here for accountability. Start talking." For the next hour, Carter detailed years of misconduct within the precinct. He spoke of falsified reports, ignored complaints, and the unwritten rule that protected officers at all costs. His voice was strained, his words dripping with bitterness as he recounted the culture that had emboldened him, and others like him, to act without fear of consequences. "And Captain Barnes?" Reed asked, her pen poised over her notepad. "How involved was he?" Carter hesitated. Betraying Barnes felt like crossing a line he couldn't come back from. But he knew the captain wouldn't hesitate to do the same to him. "Barnes knew everything," he said finally. "He covered for us. Signed off on every lie." Reed nodded, jotting down notes. "Anything else?" Carter rubbed his hands over his face, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Yeah. There's one more thing. The Harper case? It's not the first time something like that's happened. And it won't be the last." Back at Naomi's house, the air was finally still. Ava was asleep, curled up under her favorite blanket on the couch. Naomi sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her. She scrolled through news articles, each one detailing the growing scope of the DOJ's investigation. The words blurred together as exhaustion pulled at her. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention. It was a text from Angela Daniels. "Carter has agreed to cooperate. He's giving them everything." Naomi stared at the message, her emotions tangled. Relief, anger, and a lingering unease settled over her. She closed her eyes, the memory of Carter's slap flashing in her mind. His cooperation didn't erase what he had done, but it was a step toward accountability. The next morning, the city awoke to news of Carter's cooperation. The headlines painted a picture of a man trying to save himself at the expense of the system that had protected him for so long. Officer Todd Carter turns informant in DOJ investigation. Former officer details corruption within local precinct. Is this the end of impunity for law enforcement? The protests, which had already gained momentum, swelled even further. Outside City Hall, thousands gathered, their voices united in chants of "Justice for all" and "End police corruption." Naomi stood in the crowd, Ava by her side. The sense of solidarity around her was overwhelming. Strangers approached her, offering words of support and encouragement. Ava clung to her mother's hand, her small voice joining in the chants. Angela Daniels appeared at Naomi's side, her expression calm but determined. "The tide is turning," Angela said. Carter's testimony could bring down the entire leadership of the precinct. Naomi nodded, her gaze focused on the stage where speakers rallied the crowd. "It's not just about him," she said quietly. "It's about making sure this never happens again." Inside the precinct, Captain Barnes was pacing his office, his phone glued to his ear. His normally composed demeanor had cracked under the pressure. "You think I didn't know this was coming?" he barked into the phone. "We need to control the narrative before this gets worse." His assistant knocked on the door, stepping inside hesitantly. "Captain, the DOJ just issued a warrant for your emails and files. They're pulling everything." Barnes slammed his phone down, his face flushing with anger. "Get me the union rep," he growled. "Now." The assistant nodded and hurried out. Barnes sat heavily in his chair, his mind racing. He had spent years building a career on manipulation and power, but now it was unraveling faster than he could contain it. By the evening, news outlets began releasing snippets of Carter's testimony. His words were damning, exposing a culture of corruption that had festered unchecked for years. Activists called for the immediate resignation of the precinct's leadership, and pressure on the mayor's office grew exponentially. Naomi watched the coverage from her living room, her hands trembling as she listened to Carter's words. For the first time, she felt the full scope of the battle she was fighting. This wasn't just about her or Ava. It was about dismantling a system that had allowed people like Carter to thrive. The city was on edge. The revelations from Todd Carter's testimony had thrown the precinct into disarray, igniting calls for resignations at every level of leadership. News anchors reported live from City Hall, the precinct, and even Carter's apartment building, where the disgraced officer had gone into hiding. The air felt charged, as if the weight of years of silence and injustice were finally cracking under the strain. Naomi sat at her kitchen table, her hands resting on a notebook filled with her own notes and reflections. She had spent the last few days trying to balance being a mother to Ava and being the reluctant face of a movement that now extended far beyond her personal experience. Every time she looked at Ava, she felt the resolve to continue pushing forward. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from Angela Daniels. "The mayor's office has called for an emergency meeting tonight. They're feeling the pressure. It's working." Naomi exhaled deeply, a small smile tugging at her lips. She closed her notebook and looked over at Ava, who was busy coloring at the kitchen counter. "Ava," Naomi called gently. The little girl looked up, her bright eyes curious. "Yes, Mommy. How about you stay with Ms. Johnson next door for a bit?" "Mommy has some work to do," Naomi said. Ava hesitated but nodded, sliding off her chair and grabbing her stuffed animal. She approached Naomi, giving her a tight hug. "Be brave, Mommy." Naomi kissed her daughter's forehead. "I will, baby. I promise." The mayor's office was a flurry of activity. Officials moved quickly through the halls, their expressions tense as they prepared for the emergency meeting. Angela Daniels arrived with Naomi, both women walking with purpose into the crowded room where reporters and city officials had gathered. The mayor, a middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed beard and a perpetually tired expression, stood behind a podium. He raised his hands to quiet the room before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming on such short notice. The events of the past week have brought to light serious issues within our police department. Issues that we can no longer ignore." The room buzzed with murmurs as he continued. "Effective immediately, we are initiating a full review of the department's leadership and practices. Several officers, including Captain Barnes, have been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the DOJ's investigation." Naomi watched from the back of the room, her heart racing. The mayor's words were significant, but they felt like just the beginning. The real change would come only if the promises made today were kept. When the mayor finished, Angela stepped forward, ushering Naomi toward the front of the room. Reporters turned their attention to her, their cameras flashing as she took the podium. Naomi's hands gripped the edges of the podium, her voice steady but emotional. "I never wanted to be here. I never wanted to stand in front of you because of what happened to me and my daughter. But I'm here because this isn't just my story. It's the story of so many people who have been silenced, ignored, and mistreated." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "This isn't just about justice for me and Ava. This is about making sure no one else has to go through what we did. It's about holding people accountable and rebuilding trust. And we won't stop until that happens." The room erupted into applause, the sound almost overwhelming. Naomi stepped back, her heart pounding as Angela placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Meanwhile, Todd Carter sat in the darkened living room of his apartment, the glow of the television casting long shadows across the walls. The news coverage had shifted focus, with anchors now discussing the broader implications of his testimony. "Officer Carter's cooperation has revealed a deeply rooted culture of corruption within the precinct," one anchor said. "While his admissions have led to significant developments, many question whether his actions are too little, too late." Carter muttered under his breath, the bitterness in his voice palpable. He grabbed the remote and turned off the TV, plunging the room into silence. His phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up, seeing a message from an unknown number. "You think this will save you? You're just as guilty as the rest of them." Carter tossed the phone onto the couch, his chest tightening. The walls felt like they were closing in, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. He had thought cooperating would provide him with a way out, but now it felt like he was sinking deeper into the quicksand he had created. That night, the largest protest yet took place outside the precinct. Thousands of people filled the streets, their voices a thunderous call for change. The crowd moved with a shared purpose, their signs illuminated by the glow of streetlights and camera flashes. Naomi stood near the front, surrounded by supporters. Ava stayed home with a neighbor, but her presence was felt in every step Naomi took. Angela Daniels handed Naomi a megaphone, nodding toward the crowd. Naomi hesitated for a moment before lifting the megaphone. Her voice rang out, strong and clear. "We are here because we refuse to be silent. We refuse to accept injustice as normal. This is our city, our community, and it's time for change." The crowd roared in response, their chants echoing into the night. Naomi felt a surge of strength, the kind that came from knowing she wasn't alone. Inside the precinct, Captain Barnes sat in his office, his face pale as he stared at the documents spread across his desk. The DOJ's investigation had uncovered a web of lies and cover-ups that stretched back years. Barnes knew his time was up. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. 2 DOJ agents entered, their expressions neutral but firm. "Captain Barnes, we have a warrant for your arrest," one of them said, stepping forward. Barnes didn't resist. He stood slowly, his hands shaking as they cuffed him. As he was led out of the precinct, the officers who remained watched in silence, their expressions a mix of shock and relief. Outside, the protesters cheered as Barnes was escorted to a waiting car. Naomi watched from the crowd, her chest tight with emotion. This was a victory, but she knew the fight was far from over. The city had reached a boiling point. News of Captain Barnes' arrest spread like wildfire, and the streets buzzed with an energy that felt equal parts vindication and anticipation. The precinct, once a fortress of unchecked power, now felt fragile, as though the entire structure might collapse at any moment. Inside its walls, officers whispered nervously about what might come next, their confidence eroded by the relentless investigation. Naomi woke early, the first rays of sunlight streaming through her bedroom window. For the first time in days, Ava had slept soundly, curled up beside her mother, her small hand clutching Naomi's shirt. Naomi watched her daughter's peaceful face, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past week. She slid out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake Ava. As she moved to the kitchen, the quiet of the house felt foreign. She made a cup of tea and sat at the table, staring at her reflection in the dark surface of the liquid. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from Angela Daniels. "The DOJ is holding a press conference today. They'll be unveiling the full scope of the investigation. You should be there." Naomi's heart raced as she read the words. The weight of everything they had fought for felt overwhelming, but she knew she couldn't stop now. She replied with a simple, "I'll be there." By midday, the steps of City Hall were crowded with reporters, activists, and curious onlookers. Naomi stood near the front with Angela by her side, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The air was thick with anticipation as Agent Samantha Reed approached the podium, her expression calm but resolute. "Good afternoon," Reed began, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. Over the past several weeks, the Department of Justice has conducted a thorough investigation into the practices of the city's police department. "What we have uncovered is deeply troubling." Reed paused, allowing the gravity of her words to sink in. The crowd fell silent. "We have identified a pattern of systemic misconduct, including falsified reports, excessive force, and the deliberate suppression of complaints against officers. This culture of abuse was not limited to individual actions, but was enabled and perpetuated by leadership within the department." Gasps rippled through the audience. Naomi felt a chill run down her spine as Reed continued. "As of today, multiple officers and senior leaders, including Captain Barnes, have been charged with various crimes, ranging from obstruction of justice to conspiracy to violate civil rights. These actions are not reflective of the values we expect from those sworn to protect and serve." Reed's gaze swept the crowd, her tone softening slightly. "We recognize the pain and anger this has caused in the community. Today is not the end. It is the beginning of rebuilding trust and ensuring accountability." Todd Carter sat in a small room at the DOJ field office, his hands resting on the table. He had been cooperating for days, sharing everything he knew about the precinct's inner workings. But today, he felt the full weight of his decisions. Agent Reed entered the room, a folder in her hand. She sat across from Carter, her expression unreadable. "You've done the right thing by coming forward," she said simply. "But let's be clear, your cooperation doesn't absolve you of responsibility." Carter nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I know," he muttered. I didn't think it would go this far. Reed raised an eyebrow. Didn't think what would go this far? The investigation? Or the consequences of your actions? Carter looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Both, he admitted. Reed leaned forward slightly. Officer Carter, you played a role in this system, but you also helped expose it. The court will take that into account. What happens next is up to them, and to you. That evening, the city held a public forum at the community center. Activists, residents, and leaders gathered to discuss the impact of the DOJ's findings and the path forward. Naomi sat near the front, surrounded by supporters who had rallied around her since the beginning. When it was her turn to speak, Naomi approached the microphone slowly, her heart pounding. She took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room before she began. "This week has been one of the hardest of my life," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "What happened to me and my daughter is something no one should ever have to endure. But I've learned something in all of this. We are stronger together." The crowd murmured in agreement, their attention fixed on her. "The changes we're starting to see aren't just because of me," Naomi continued. "They're because of all of us. Everyone who refused to stay silent, who demanded accountability, who believed we could do better." Her voice wavered slightly as she added, "We still have a long way to go, but I know we can get there. For Ava, for every child, and for every person who has ever felt powerless. This is just the beginning." The room erupted into applause, the sound filling every corner of the space. Naomi stepped back, tears streaming down her face as she returned to her seat. The city had reached a pivotal moment. The DOJ investigation had not only uncovered a network of corruption within the precinct, but also set off a wave of accountability that no one could have predicted. Arrests, resignations, and public outcry had reshaped the landscape of the police department. For Naomi and Ava, it felt like the end of a nightmare, but also the beginning of something entirely new. Naomi sat in a courtroom, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The walls echoed with murmurs as the judge entered, signaling the room to rise. This was the final hearing for Todd Carter, who had pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including misconduct and abuse of power. Carter stood at the defendant's table, his once confident demeanor reduced to nervous stillness. His lawyer whispered to him, but he barely acknowledged it. Naomi watched him from across the room, her expression calm but resolute. This wasn't about revenge. It was about closure. The judge's voice broke the silence. After reviewing the evidence and testimony, this court sentences Todd Carter to 5 years in prison, with a possibility of parole after 3. Additionally, he is permanently barred from holding any position in law enforcement. The gavel struck, and the room erupted into hushed conversations. Carter was escorted out by officers, his head bowed. Naomi exhaled deeply, the weight she had carried for weeks beginning to lift. Angela Daniels leaned over and whispered, "This is a victory, Naomi. But it's only part of the fight." Naomi nodded. "I know. But it's a start." Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, their signs and chants filling the air with energy. The news of Carter's sentencing spread quickly, sparking celebrations among activists and community members who had fought tirelessly for justice. Naomi stepped out with Angela by her side, the crowd erupting into cheers as they spotted her. She smiled faintly, overwhelmed by the support. Ava, holding her mother's hand tightly, looked up at her. "Mommy, they're happy," Ava said, her voice filled with wonder. "Yes, baby," Naomi replied, kneeling to meet her daughter's gaze. "They're happy because we made a difference." In a press conference later that week, Agent Samantha Reed addressed the public one last time. She stood at the podium, flanked by members of her team, her tone serious but hopeful. The Department of Justice has concluded its investigation into the city's police department. As a result, over a dozen officers and senior leaders have been charged with various crimes, and systemic reforms are being implemented to prevent future abuses. Reed paused, her gaze steady. "We know this is just one step in a larger journey. Real change requires ongoing commitment, from the justice system, from law enforcement, and from the community. Together, we can build a future where accountability and fairness are not exceptions but expectations." The crowd of reporters fired questions, but Reed maintained her composure, answering each one with clarity. The message was clear. The system was being rebuilt, and this time, it would be stronger. Naomi sat on her porch that evening, Ava playing with her stuffed animal nearby. The quiet of the night felt surreal after weeks of chaos. The stars above were bright, casting a soft glow over the neighborhood. Angela arrived, holding a folder. She handed it to Naomi, who opened it cautiously. Inside were details about a scholarship fund being set up in Ava's name, funded by donations from activists and community organizations. It's their way of saying thank you, Angela said, sitting beside her, for standing up when it mattered most. Naomi smiled, tears welling in her eyes. I never thought this would happen, she admitted. I just wanted to protect my daughter. And you did, Angela said firmly. But you also protected so many others by speaking out. Don't forget that. Naomi nodded, her gaze drifting to Ava, who was now chasing fireflies in the yard. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace. In the days that followed, the city began to heal. The precinct underwent a complete overhaul, with new leadership committed to transparency and accountability. Community members were invited to participate in oversight committees, ensuring that the voices of the people were heard. Naomi returned to her routine, determined to give Ava the normalcy she deserved. But she remained active in the movement, attending meetings and speaking at events to keep the momentum alive. One evening, Ava climbed into her lap, holding a picture she had drawn. It was of two stick figures, a tall one and a small one, standing hand in hand beneath a rainbow. Is this us? Naomi asked, smiling. Yes, Ava said. We're happy again. Naomi hugged her daughter tightly, her heart full. Yes, baby. We are. I ask you to please comment on your impressions and opinions in the comments. I would feel very happy if you leave me a like.